The morning sun had only just crested the horizon when Fort Bragg began to hum with activity. It was open day, a time when families of service members, veterans, and curious civilians were invited to tour the sprawling military installation, walk among the exhibits, and catch a rare glimpse of the life behind the fences. Colorful banners flapped lightly in the breeze, and the smell of food trucks mixed with the distinct metallic tongue of weapon oil lingering from the equipment displays. Children tugged their parents toward camouflaged Humvees, eager to climb inside, while groups of veterans stood off to the side, trading stories no one else could fully understand. Amid the noise and movement, one figure moved with remarkable quietness. She was a young woman, dressed plainly in jeans and a dark jacket, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid that brushed against her back. Unlike the excited civilians, who darted from one display to another, she walked steadily, almost with purpose. Her eyes didn't dart with curiosity or shine with the gleam of novelty. Instead, they scanned the area like a surveyor, absorbing every detail as though she had walked these grounds before. At first glance, she didn't stand out much. No flashy clothing, no entourage, no obvious signs of authority. Yet there was something in her bearing that made her presence impossible to dismiss. She wasn't gawking at the heavy artillery or posing for pictures in front of tanks. Instead, she paused at each exhibit, not for entertainment, but for study. It was the kind of observation that came not from fascination, but from familiarity. A pair of young soldiers, barely out of training themselves, noticed her as they stood near the display of armored vehicles. "She doesn't look like she belongs here," one whispered, nudging the other. "Civilian day, man. They all don't belong here," the other replied with a shrug, though he, too, found himself staring longer than he intended. She walked past them without acknowledgement, her focus fixed ahead. It wasn't rudeness, it was detachment. She moved as though the noise and chatter around her didn't exist, as though her mind was tuned to something deeper, something invisible to everyone else. At the far end of the courtyard, rows of weapon displays gleamed under the rising sun. M16s, M4 carbines, pistols, and shotguns were neatly laid out on tables. Civilians circled the area, some asking questions, others merely taking pictures. The rifles were the main attraction, drawing boys and grown men alike to admire their power up close. The young woman approached, and for the first time, her pace slowed. Her eyes lingered on the rifles, scanning them in order, almost as if cataloging them in her mind. The soldiers managing the tables had grown, used to answering the same questions. "How heavy is it?" Or, "Do you really use this overseas?" But when her turn came, she asked nothing. Instead, she stood silently, studying each piece with an intensity that made the staff uneasy. General Marcus Harris, a seasoned officer with more than 3 decades of service, happened to be nearby. Tall, broad-shouldered, his once black hair now streaked with gray, Harris carried himself with the air of a man who had commanded respect in deserts, jungles, and conference rooms alike. At that moment, however, he wasn't inspecting the troops or barking orders. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, sipping coffee from a dented metal thermos, exchanging light conversation with visiting veterans. It was by chance that his gaze swept across the crowd and landed on her. He noticed her not because of how she looked, but because of how she didn't. She wasn't laughing or gawking like the others. She wasn't marveling at the rifles with wide-eyed admiration. She was different. Harris had been in the Army long enough to recognize certain subtleties: posture, focus, the way someone's eyes locked onto an object. And this woman's eyes were not the eyes of a tourist. At first, Harris dismissed it. He turned back to the veteran beside him, chuckling at a light-hearted remark about retirement. But something tugged at the edge of his mind. He looked back again, this time more carefully. The woman had moved closer to the rifle table, her hands clasped behind her back, as if holding herself back from touching the weapons. She was patient, almost too patient, waiting for a moment when the crowd shifted. The young soldier at the table, a fresh recruit with less than a year of service, noticed her and gave a polite smile. "These are just display pieces, Nam," he said, reciting the line he'd repeated 100 times that morning. She nodded slightly, but didn't move away. Her eyes had fixed on one rifle in particular, the M24. The M24 wasn't just another rifle. It was the Army's standard sniper weapon, precise and deadly, capable of hitting targets nearly a kilometer away with chilling accuracy. To most civilians, it was just a bigger gun, but to anyone with experience, it represented an entirely different league of skill. It wasn't something you casually admired. It was something you respected. The woman tilted her head slightly, almost as if measuring the rifle with her eyes. Then, in a voice calm and even, she spoke. "May I?" The soldier blinked. "Excuse me?" She gestured toward the M24. "May I hold it?" The recruit hesitated. Civilians weren't usually allowed to touch the rifles, especially not something as specialized as the M24. But her tone wasn't demanding. It was steady, respectful. It carried a quiet authority that unnerved him. Against his better judgment, he nodded cautiously. Yeah, but just for a moment." The instant her fingers touched the rifle, something changed. She didn't fumble or handle it awkwardly like most civilians. She lifted it with ease, cradling it as though it were an extension of her body. Her hands found their positions instinctively, one on the grip, the other supporting the barrel. She checked the bolt, tested the weight, and peered down the scope. Each movement was fluid, practiced, precise. The soldier stared, his mouth slightly open. "What the—" he muttered under his breath. Nearby civilians noticed too. A few whispered, nudging each other as they pointed. This wasn't the clumsy curiosity of a tourist. This was muscle memory, honed by repetition. From across the courtyard, General Harris caught the shift in atmosphere. Conversations around him dimmed as murmurs rippled through the crowd. He turned, following the direction of their gazes. And then he saw her. The young woman stood with the M24 snug against her shoulder, her eye aligned with the scope. Her body posture was textbook perfect, back straight, elbow tucked, weight evenly balanced. She wasn't posing. She wasn't pretending. She was doing what she had done countless times before. The words left his mouth almost involuntarily. Who gave her that rifle? His voice cut through the chatter, sharp and commanding. The crowd turned to him, then back to her, waiting to see what would happen. The young soldier at the table stiffened, realizing too late he had perhaps made a mistake. But the general wasn't angry. He was frozen. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in disbelief. For in all his years of service, he had learned one undeniable truth: there are some things that cannot be faked. And the way she handled that rifle was one of them. The silence that followed General Harris's sharp demand hung over the courtyard like a heavy fog. Soldiers glanced at one another uneasily, unsure if they should intervene, while civilians froze in a mix of curiosity and nervous anticipation. Children who had been giggling moments earlier quieted, tugging at their parents' sleeves, sensing something unusual was unfolding. The young woman, however, seemed completely unaffected. She didn't flinch at the general's voice, nor did she rush to explain herself. Instead, she continued to hold the M24 with calm steadiness, her breathing even, her posture unshaken. She shifted the bolt, listening to the smooth metallic slide, then returned the rifle into firing position. It was as though she were alone on the range, the world around her invisible. The young soldier who had let her touch the rifle looked pale. His hands fidgeted at his side, torn between obeying his instincts, snatching the weapon back, and the undeniable sense that he had just stumbled into something far larger than himself. He glanced nervously at General Harris, who was now striding across the courtyard, each step firm and deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively to make way for him. Conversations that had once filled the air with casual chatter were replaced by low murmurs. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "She's not a soldier, is she?" asked another. "No way a civilian handles a rifle like that." The woman lowered the rifle slightly and turned her head. Her eyes met Harris's as he approached. Dark, steady, unblinking, they held none of the fear he might have expected. Instead, there was recognition, as though she had seen men like him many times before. When Harris reached the table, he didn't speak immediately. He stood a few feet away, studying her carefully, his years of battlefield instinct sharpening his perception. The rifle wasn't what struck him anymore. It was her demeanor. Calm under pressure, composed in the face of authority. It was a look he had seen in seasoned operators, not tourists. Finally, he spoke. "Where did you learn to handle that?" His tone was controlled, not accusatory, but firm. The woman tilted, her head slightly, as though weighing whether to answer truthfully. Then she smiled faintly, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Life teaches many things, General." Her voice was soft, but it carried. Something about it commanded attention. She set the rifle down gently on the table, her movements slow and respectful, then folded her hands in front of her. The young soldier beside her released a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His relief was short-lived, however, because Harris's gaze shifted to him. "Did you authorize her to pick up that weapon, Private?" Harris's voice was suddenly stern. The soldier straightened, sweat beading at his brow. "Sir," she asked politely, "and I thought—" He stammered, his words collapsing under the weight of the general's stare. Harris held up hand, silencing him. "We'll address that later." He returned his attention to the woman. Around them, the crowd leaned in, straining to catch every word. "You're not here to play tourist," Harris said quietly. "So why are you here?" For a moment, the woman said nothing. Then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, she asked a question of her own. "Do you still run long-range qualification drills here?" The general's brows furrowed. It was not the response he expected. "What did you say?" "Long-range drills," she repeated. 800 meters. Wind compensation, elevation adjustments, breathing control. Do your snipers still train that way?" The words rolled off her tongue, not as guesses but as facts, spoken with the confidence of someone who had done it herself. The crowd gasped. Several soldiers exchanged startled looks. This was not idle curiosity, it was technical knowledge. Harris felt his chest tighten. This woman wasn't bluffing. Whoever she was, she knew far too much. "Who are you?" He asked again, his voice sharper this time. Her eyes flickered briefly, as though a memory flashed behind them. Then she looked back at him with that same faint, unreadable smile. "Someone who has seen what your rifles can do," she said softly. The words landed heavily, chilling even the bystanders. The weight of her statement was unmistakable. She had not read about rifles in a book, nor learned about them in passing. She had lived through their use, perhaps on the giving end, perhaps on the receiving. A ripple of unease spread through the soldiers around them. The tension was broken only when a civilian woman tugged at her son's hand, whispering urgently, "Come on, let's go see the tanks." The boy resisted, wanting to stay, but the mother pulled him away, sensing that this moment was not meant for casual spectators. Harris drew a slow breath. His instincts told him to press further, but another part of him, the part tempered by decades of experience, advised patience. Pushing too hard might close her off completely. He needed to know more, and rushing wouldn't get him answers. He softened his tone. You speak like someone who's been behind the scope. Not many civilians could ask that question. The woman lowered her gaze briefly, then raised it again, unflinching. I've seen through scopes, General, not always by choice. The cryptic response only deepened the mystery. Harris studied her face more closely now. She looked young, mid to late 20s, perhaps, but her eyes told a different story. They were old eyes, weary eyes. Eyes that had watched too much destruction for someone her age. Behind him, the young soldier shifted nervously. Sir, should I stand down? Harris said curtly without turning. The general clasped his hands behind his back, falling silent as he considered his next words. Around them, the courtyard buzzed again as families moved on, though many lingered nearby, pretending to admire other exhibits, while keeping an ear turned toward the encounter. Finally, Harris leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Tell me, who gave you that rifle before today? For the first time, her expression hardened. She held his gaze for a long moment, then spoke in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Not who, General. Where? Harris's jaw tightened. It wasn't a full answer, but it was enough to confirm what he had suspected. This was no accident. She hadn't stumbled onto the M24 out of curiosity. She had chosen it deliberately, and she had done so because it meant something to her. Before he could reply, the woman straightened and set her hands on the table, signaling that the conversation, at least for now, was over. Thank you for letting me see it, she said politely, turning to the soldier beside her. It's been a long time. With that, she stepped back into the crowd. But General Harris didn't move. He watched her carefully as she disappeared into the throng of civilians, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet answer. He had seen many unusual things in his career, but this encounter was different. Something told him this was only the beginning. General Marcus Harris stood rooted in place, his boots pressing into the gravel of the courtyard, as though the earth itself was holding him steady. The crowd that had gathered dispersed slowly, but not entirely. Even as families and visitors moved along to other exhibits, their eyes kept darting back toward the young woman who had just stepped into the sea of people. It was as if everyone instinctively knew they had witnessed something out of the ordinary, something that did not fit into the neat, predictable rhythm of an Army open day. Harris's coffee had long gone cold in his hand, though he hadn't noticed. His gaze tracked the woman until she disappeared behind a cluster of civilians near the armored convoy. Only then did he finally draw a breath and look back at the weapon table where the M24 rested. The rifle sat innocently, gleaming in the sunlight, but Harris's mind replayed the image of her holding it, her posture, her grip, her absolute certainty. He had seen countless recruits and seasoned soldiers mishandle weapons on their first touch. Most civilians treated rifles like fragile artifacts or dangerous toys, but she had embraced it like a professional, like someone who had fired 1,000 rounds through it before breakfast. Sir? The young private's voice snapped Harris from his thoughts. The soldier stood stiffly by the table, his face pale with dread. He expected punishment for letting the woman touch the weapon. Relax, son, Harris said, his voice calmer now. You did what you thought was polite. This isn't on you. Still, Harris couldn't ignore the knowing in his gut. Civilians weren't supposed to hold weapons unsupervised, much less handle them like they belonged in their hands. He needed to know more. He turned back toward the direction she had gone, but she was nowhere in sight. The crowd had swallowed her whole, leaving Harris with nothing but questions. As he stood there, a few of his senior officers approached, drawn by the commotion. Colonel Raymond, his operations chief, raised a brow. General, what happened here? Harris glanced at him, then at the rifle. You saw her? I caught the tail end, Raymond admitted. Who was she? A veteran? Harris shook his head slowly. No, at least not one I recognize. But she knew exactly what she was doing. Another officer chimed in, skeptical. Sir, maybe she just watched videos. Civilians can pick up a lot online these days. Harris shot him a look so sharp, it silenced him instantly. No, you don't fake stance like that. You don't fake. The way she checked the bolt, the way she aligned her shoulder. That takes training. Real training. The group fell silent. Soldiers nearby, who had witnessed the scene firsthand, were whispering among themselves. Words like sniper, contractor, and refugee floated in the air. Harris caught fragments of their gossip, but he didn't shut them down. Not yet. He wanted to hear what they thought, to see if anyone recognized her. One young sergeant stepped forward hesitantly. Sir, with respect, I've heard stories. Some of the guys who served overseas Afghanistan, Iraq, they talked about locals who helped, civilians who weren't official, but still fought, still spotted targets, saved lives. Harris narrowed his eyes. And you think she's one of them? The sergeant shrugged. I don't know, sir. But the way she moved, it wasn't American training. It was survival. The word survival lodged in Harris's chest like a stone. He had spent his career surrounded by men and women, forged by structured discipline, molded by boot camps and field manuals. But survivalists, those who learned not from drills, but from life and death, were different. Their skills were raw, instinctive, carved from necessity. Sometimes they were sharper than the military's finest. Harris dismissed the officers. With a curt nod, keep your ears open. If anyone hears who she is, I want to know. They saluted and moved off, but Harris remained. His instincts, honed through decades of war zones and negotiations, told him this wasn't the last time he would see her. Meanwhile, the young woman drifted away from the crowd, seeking the quieter edges of the base. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. But she knew eyes were on her now, and part of her regretted touching the M24. Not because she wasn't capable, but because it had revealed more than she intended. Her mind flickered with memories she tried to suppress. The sound of distant artillery, the acrid smoke of burning fields, the desperate cries of villagers in the night, and always, the cold, steady weight of a rifle in her hands. She had not come here to make a spectacle. She had come for closure, for the simple act of seeing once again the weapon that had defined too many of her nights. But she had underestimated the sharp eyes of a man like General Harris. Back at the table, Harris finally set down his empty thermos, his decision made. He wasn't about to let this encounter fade into rumor. He turned to the private. Did she say anything else to you? The private shook his head. Just asked if she could hold it, sir. That's all. Harris frowned. That's not all. She knew exactly what she was asking. He straightened his uniform, his expression hardening. He wasn't just curious. No, he was determined. A general didn't ignore mysteries like this, not on his base. Later that afternoon, Harris sat in his office overlooking the training grounds. Files were stacked neatly on his desk, reports waiting for review, but his mind wasn't on paperwork. He stared out the window, the image of the woman replaying over and over in his mind. Who are you? He muttered under his breath. He picked up the phone. Raymond, get me intel. I want to know who that woman is. Civilian records, visitor. Logs, everything. If she came through that gate today, her name's somewhere. Yes, sir, came the reply. Harris leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. He had faced enemies with rifles, negotiated with allies, and buried soldiers who had given their last breath. But this was different. This was a civilian who had just held the respect of his soldiers without wearing a uniform, without speaking a rank, and Harris didn't know whether to be wary or impressed. By the time the sun began to set over Fort Bragg, the whispers had spread across the base. In the mess hall, in the barracks, in the quiet corners where soldiers gathered, the story was retold with slight variations. A civilian picked up the M24 and handled it like a pro. No, she wasn't just a civilian. She was someone who fought with us overseas. I heard the general froze when he saw her. Each retelling added fuel to the mystery, and each soldier who heard it felt the same gnawing question. Who gave her that rifle before today? And General Harris, sitting in his office as the last light faded, knew one thing for certain. He had only just begun to uncover the truth. General Marcus Harris wasn't a man easily unsettled. He had stared down insurgents across deserts, negotiated tense ceasefires in dimly lit rooms, and walked through battlefields where silence was more haunting than gunfire. But that night, as he sat in his office, staring at the dim glow of the desk lamp, he couldn't shake the image of the young woman with the rifle. Her words echoed, "Not who, General, where?" It was the kind of answer that wasn't really an answer at all, but Harris had dealt with enough people in his career to recognize it for what it was, a deflection. She had no intention of telling him the full truth, not yet. But the truth had a way of surfacing, especially on a military base where curiosity spread faster than wildfire. The next morning, when Harris entered the mess hall, he felt the atmosphere shift. Soldiers lowered their voices when he passed, but he caught enough fragments to know the story was already circulating. Handled it like a sniper. Some say she was a local interpreter overseas. Heard she saved a whole platoon once. He kept walking, his expression unreadable, but inside he was listening. Whispers weren't evidence, but they were threads, and Harris knew how to follow threads. Later that day, he summoned Colonel Raymond to his office. The colonel arrived with a file folder in hand, his face grim. We pulled the visitor logs. "Sir," Raymond began. Her name's on the list. She signed in under Elena Marcus, civilian. No military service record in our databases. Harris leaned back in his chair. "Elena Marcus," he repeated slowly. The name was unfamiliar, but the image of her holding the rifle was burned into his memory. What else? Raymond hesitated before sliding a second sheet across the desk. Her background isn't clean-cut. She was born overseas. Small village on the edge of conflict zones. Central Asia. Records are fuzzy. Family killed when she was young. Refugee status granted a decade ago. Eventually moved to the U.S. Became a citizen. Harris skimmed the page. Refugee. Family killed. Survivor. The pieces were beginning to form a picture. He looked up. And her connection to the army? Raymond's lips pressed into a thin line. That's where it gets interesting. Some of the reports from our units overseas mention a local interpreter, a teenager at the time, who wasn't just translating. She guided patrols through hostile terrain, spotted ambushes, even provided intel that saved lives. The name wasn't always the same, sometimes Elena, sometimes Lena, sometimes just the girl. But the descriptions match. Scar on the left wrist, sharp eyes, always near the forward units. Harris set the paper down and rubbed his jaw. He remembered those reports, vague and often overlooked in the chaos of operations. Civilians who helped weren't always documented thoroughly. But now, the image of her calmly inspecting the M24 took on a deeper weight. She was more than an interpreter, Harris murmured. Raymond nodded. Much more. Some soldiers swore she handled rifles better than their own spotters. Said she had a knack for reading terrain, predicting attacks before they happened. But, officially, she was never on payroll. Just there, helping, surviving. Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And now she's here, on my base, holding one of our sniper rifles like it's hers." Raymond hesitated. "Sir, do you think she came here for a reason?" Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, staring. Out at the training fields where soldiers drilled under the afternoon sun, his mind churned. He had spent his career training men and women to be warriors. Yet here was someone outside the system who had survived wars on her own terms. That kind of person didn't just wander into Fort Bragg by chance. "She came here for closure," Harris finally said. "But closure from what? I don't know yet." Meanwhile, Elena herself sat quietly on a bench near the base's memorial wall. Families passed by, laying flowers at the foot of engraved names. She traced one of the names with her fingers, her eyes distant. She remembered the faces of American soldiers who had treated her not as a burden, but as a partner. The ones who had listened when she warned of danger, who had trusted her instincts even when higher command dismissed her. Some of those names on the wall belonged to them. Men who had laughed with her over bad rations, who had shielded her during firefights, who had whispered promises that one day she would be safe. The M24 had brought it all back. The first time she'd seen one, it wasn't on display. It had been pressed into her hands by a desperate young sergeant pinned down under fire. She had never fired a sniper rifle before, but that day, instinct and necessity had merged. Her shot had saved them. From then on, they trusted her with more than words, but those memories were scars, not medals. She had carried them silently for years, building a quiet life in America, far from the noise of war. Until today, until she touched the rifle again. Back at headquarters, Harris continued piecing together the fragments. He called in 2 veterans who had served multiple tours overseas, men whose memories were sharp and whose loyalty he trusted. "You ever hear of a girl interpreter? Teenager, helped the units in the villages?" Harris asked them. The veterans exchanged looks, then one nodded slowly. "Yeah, we called her Shadow. Didn't talk much, but damn, she could see things no one else saw. I remember one time she pointed out a glint on the ridge. Said it was wrong. We thought she was crazy. Turns out it was the sun catching a rifle scope. Saved our whole squad." Harris's pulse quickened. "And her name?" The veteran frowned. "Elena, I think. But she never corrected us, no matter what we called her. Just kept helping until we left. No idea what happened to her after." Harris dismissed them with thanks, but inside, his thoughts were racing. Shadow, Elena, interpreter, survivor, sniper's eye. It all matched. She wasn't just a woman with scars. She was part of the Army's untold history, the civilians whose lives became entangled with America's wars, who never wore the uniform, but bled all the same. That evening, as the base quieted and the sun dipped low, Harris found himself walking the same path Elena had taken earlier, stopping at the memorial wall. He stood among the flowers, the engraved names glowing softly in the fading light. He imagined her here, tracing those names, reliving memories that weren't his, but were heavy all the same. He could almost see her silhouette, shoulders burdened, but unbroken. Who gave her that rifle? He whispered again, but now the question carried a different meaning. It wasn't about rules or security lapses anymore. It was about destiny. About how a girl who should have been a casualty of war instead became its reluctant protector. Harris clenched his jaw. He didn't know yet why she had come or what she wanted, but he knew one thing. This was no coincidence. Elena Marquez's story was tied to theirs, whether the Army acknowledged it or not. And Harris wasn't about to let her walk away without understanding the full truth. For the first time in years, the general felt something rare, a mixture of curiosity respect, and unease. And he knew deep down that the real story of Elena Marcus was only beginning to unfold. The base had always been a place of routine marching boots at dawn, rifle drills in the morning heat, paperwork stacked neatly on desks in offices that smelled faintly of coffee and gun oil. But in the days following Elena Marquez's visit to the weapons display, routine had fractured. Whispers spread like wildfire. Soldiers who had seen her with the M24 described the way she had handled it. Her calm posture, her steady breathing, her confidence that rivaled even their most seasoned marksmen. By the third day, the story had already grown beyond fact, twisted into legend. Some claimed she could hit a target blindfolded. Others swore she once walked into an ambush alone and led an entire squad to safety. But the truth, Messier, quieter and far more human, still lingered in the shadows. At the training field, Harris watched from a distance as two young privates argued near the firing range. "I'm telling you, she's just some civilian who got lucky," one said, adjusting his helmet. "Anyone can look impressive holding a rifle if they know a few tricks." "Tricks?" The other scoffed. "That wasn't tricks, man. Did you see her grip? Her stance? That wasn't something you learn in a YouTube video. That was combat. Real combat." Harris didn't intervene. He let the argument simmer. He wanted to see which way the tide of opinion would turn. Soldiers could be cruel, but they could also be quick to recognize strength when it revealed itself. Later that afternoon, Harris called for a quiet assembly in one of the smaller briefing halls. 100 soldiers filed in, restless but curious. Elena stood near the front, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Harris hadn't told her why she'd been invited, only that he needed her there. When the room fell silent, Harris began without preamble. "Some of you have been talking," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Talking about a visitor to our base. About a civilian who handled one of our rifles as if she'd been born with it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. But Harris raised a hand. "Rumors have their place, but facts matter more. So let's deal in facts." He turned to Elena. "Ms. Marcus, would you share with us where you learned those skills?" All eyes shifted to her. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze sweeping over the sea of uniforms. She saw skepticism in some faces, curiosity in others, and outright hostility in a few. They were soldiers, after all, proud, trained, and not accustomed to being outshone by someone outside their ranks. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't learn them in a classroom," she said softly, "and not in a training camp either. I learned them because I had to, because if I didn't, people I cared about would die." The room stilled. Harris didn't interrupt. "I was 14 when the first firefight happened in my village," Elena continued. "The U.S. soldiers were pinned down, and I was supposed to be translating for them. But language only gets you so far when bullets are flying. One of them, handing me his rifle, showed me where to aim. I remember my hands shaking, but I pulled the trigger anyway. That was the beginning." Gasps and shuffling echoed through the hall. Soldiers glanced at one another, struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet woman before them with the memory she described. "I kept working with them," Elena said. "I knew the land, the hills, the shadows where enemies liked to hide. I warned them about ambushes. I led them through routes that would keep them alive. And yes, sometimes I picked up a rifle when they needed me to." She paused, her eyes briefly dropping to the floor. "I didn't want to, but survival doesn't care about wants. It only cares about choices." The silence that followed was heavy. Harris let it linger, knowing the weight of her words needed space to settle. Then, from the back of the hall, a voice cut through. "You expect us to believe that? That the army relied on some kid? That's not protocol." A few soldiers chuckled nervously. emboldened by the challenge. Elena's head lifted, her gaze sharp. "No," she said evenly. "It wasn't protocol. But tell me something. How many times has protocol saved you when the world fell apart around you? Protocol doesn't stop bullets. People do. Decisions do." The room went quiet again. Harris felt a surge of pride, not because she was proving herself to his soldiers, but because she was teaching them something they needed to hear. He stepped forward. "Enough," he said firmly. "I've read the after-action reports myself. Maybe her name wasn't always written in black ink, but her presence was felt in red, the kind of red that comes from lives saved. Some of the names on that wall out there," he gestured toward the direction of the memorial, "are men and women who made it home because of civilians like her. Do not mistake the lack of a uniform for the lack of courage." The challenge evaporated. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The chuckles died out. Respect, hesitant at first, began to ripple through the room. After the assembly, Harris noticed the change. Soldiers who had once eyed Elena with suspicion now approached her with cautious curiosity. One young corporal asked her about spotting techniques. Another wanted to know how she could tell when a ridgeline was dangerous. She didn't boast or embellish. She explained patiently, as if every question mattered. Later, Harris caught two of the same privates who had argued earlier. "She's legit," one muttered. "Told you," the other replied. It wasn't universal acceptance. Respect never came that easily. But the shift had begun. That evening, Harris invited Elena to his office again. He poured her a cup of coffee. Though she barely touched it, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You handled yourself well today," he said. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," she replied. "I just wanted them to understand." "And they did," Harris said. "Maybe more than you think. Soldiers respect skill. They respect survival. You showed them both. But more than that, you showed them humility. You didn't stand there asking for applause. You told the truth. That's rarer than you realize." For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. It was fleeting, but Harris caught it. "You think they'll stop mocking me now?" she asked quietly. Harris shook his head. "Soldiers will always test the people they don't understand. But they'll also never forget when someone earns their respect the hard way. Today, you earned it." Outside, the night settled over the base. The routine sounds of distant trills and the hum of generators filled the air. But inside the barracks, the story had changed again. No longer was Elena just a mysterious woman who shocked them with a rifle. She was something else entirely, a reminder that wars are not fought only by those in uniform, and that respect is forged not by appearances, but by survival, sacrifice, and truth. And as Harris prepared to turn in for the night, he realized something else. Elena Marquez was no longer just a visitor. She had become a teacher, and her presence was reshaping his soldiers in ways training manuals never could. The morning sun crept over Fort Bragg like a spotlight, illuminating the neat rows of barracks, the training fields, and the long stretch of the firing range. Soldiers were already gathering, their chatter carrying across the air like static. Today wasn't an ordinary drill. Today, they were here to witness something that wasn't on the official schedule, something whispered about in mess halls, joked about in bunks, and argued about in every corner of the base. Elena Marquez was going to shoot. General Harris stood at the edge of the range, arms folded, watching as the soldiers formed a semicircle around the firing lanes. His decision hadn't been made lightly. For days, he'd listened to the rumors. Some soldiers now respected Elena, but others still doubted her. Respect was fragile here. It needed proof, something undeniable, and Harris wanted to see for himself. At the far end, an M24 sniper rifle lay resting on a bipod, gleaming in the morning light. Targets had been set at 800 meters, distant silhouettes. barely visible to the naked eye. Even for trained snipers, it was no easy task. Elena approached calmly, her expression unreadable, her steps unhurried. She wore no uniform, just a plain jacket and jeans, but the way she carried herself made it seem as though the rifle was already an extension of her. "Ms. Marquez," Harris said, his voice carrying across the range. "I appreciate you agreeing to this. I want you to understand this isn't about spectacle. It's about clarity." Alana met his gaze, her eyes calm. "I know," she said simply. "You want your soldiers to see with their own eyes." Harris nodded once. "Exactly. You're not obligated to do this. If you'd rather walk away." But she interrupted, her voice firm. "I'm not here to walk away." A ripple of anticipation moved through the watching crowd. She stepped to the firing lane, lowering herself to the ground with practiced ease. The soldiers leaned forward, whispering among themselves. Harris silenced them with a glance. Elena adjusted the bipod, her movements steady and precise. She checked the scope, dialed the elevation, and set the windage without hesitation. Each motion was smooth, deliberate, born not of training manuals, but of lived necessity. Private Daniels, standing near Harris, muttered, "She looks like she's done this 100 times. Harris didn't reply. He was too focused on her hands. They were scarred, calloused in places where rifles left their mark. Finally, Elena loaded a round. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising slowly, then exhaled until the world seemed to narrow into silence. The murmurs died. The only sound was the faint hum of wind across the open range. She squeezed the trigger. Crack! The shot rang out, sharp and final. A half-second later, the target at 800 meters clanged, a neat hole dead center. Gasps erupted. Someone swore under their breath. But Elena wasn't done. Without a word, she chambered another round, adjusted the scope slightly, and fired again. Another direct hit, then another, and another. 5 shots in a row, each one drilling the target with surgical precision. By the time she lowered the rifle, the silence was deafening. Soldiers who had doubted her stood frozen, their skepticism shattered. Harris stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. He studied the distant target through binoculars, confirming what everyone already knew. Then he lowered them, his expression unreadable, though inside he felt something stir. Mixture of awe and humility. "Impressive," he said simply. Elena stood, brushing dust from her hands. "It's just practice," she replied. "Skill fades if you don't use it. But memory never fades." Her voice carried a weight that made the soldiers glance at one another. They all understood she wasn't just talking about shooting. She was talking about the memories of war that never left her, the kind that haunted her in silence. After the demonstration, the soldiers clustered together, buzzing with conversation. "Did you see that grouping? Tighter than half our snipers. Man, I wouldn't want her on the other side of a scope." Respect, full respect, but Elena didn't bask in their admiration. She quietly stepped away, walking toward the edge of the range where the noise faded. Harris followed, giving her a moment before speaking. "You know what you just did, don't you?" he asked. She looked at him, her expression weary but steady. "I proved what they wanted to see. But proving something doesn't erase the past." "No," Harris agreed, "but it changes the present. These men and women, they'll never look at you the same again. Not as a stranger, not as a rumor, but as someone who's earned their respect the hard way." Elena's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Respect doesn't mean peace. I didn't come here to join your army, General. I came because I wanted to see if I was still me. If the part of me that survived all that still existed." Harris nodded slowly. He understood more than she realized. Soldiers wrestled with the same question every time they returned from Deployment. Am I still me? Or just what the war made me? You're more than what the war made you, he said quietly. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the range echoing faintly behind them. That night, word of Alana's shooting spread across the base like fire. By the time the sun set, her demonstration had already grown into legend. Some swore she hit a coin at 800 meters. Others claimed she adjusted for wind without even looking. But beneath the exaggerations, something real had shifted. Soldiers who once mocked her now spoke of her with reverence. Even those who hadn't, seen the shots firsthand, treated her presence with a new kind of respect. Harris knew what had happened. She had passed the unspoken test. The kind of test no briefing could prepare for, no rank could demand. She had shown undeniable skill, and in doing so, she had reminded them all that courage wears many faces. Yet, Harris also sensed something deeper. Elena hadn't sought this moment for glory. She had done it reluctantly, almost with sorrow, as if each shot was a reminder of the battles she thought she had left behind. For her, this wasn't triumph. It was confirmation of truth she could no longer avoid, the part of her shaped by. War wasn't gone. It was alive, breathing, and undeniable. And Harris knew, as he looked at the stars above the base that night, that the next part of her story was about to unfold, because respect was only the beginning. The base was quieter than usual that night. The desert air had cooled, carrying with it the faint hum of generators and the distant cadence of boots striking pavement as the last of the evening drills wrapped up. Yet inside General Marcus Harris's office, silence reigned. He sat at his desk, but he wasn't reading the reports in front of him. The papers lay untouched, the inked words blurring into meaninglessness. His mind was elsewhere at the firing range earlier that day, watching Alana Marquez hit target after target with the M24, as though the rifle were simply an extension of her will. Harris had seen great marksmen before. He'd seen snipers who could split playing cards in half at 1,000 yards, soldiers who could hit moving targets under pressure with mechanical precision. But what struck him about Elena wasn't the perfection of her aim. It was the stillness in her eyes as she fired. There was no thrill, no pride, no adrenaline spark, only necessity. It was the look of someone who had carried the weight of survival too long to mistake skill for glory. Earlier that evening, Harris had taken a quiet walk across the base. Soldiers saluted him as he passed, but he noticed how the conversation shifted in his wake. "She's the real deal," one young corporal whispered. "Never thought a civilian could outshoot half the snipers here," another replied. "Not just outshoot," someone added. "Outsteady. Did you see her? Like the shots didn't even touch her." The general's lips pressed into a thin line. They were right, her performance hadn't just been skillful, it had been unshakable. Yet he also sensed the cost. Every shot she fired had drawn her deeper into memories she likely wished to keep buried. As Harris walked, he found himself drifting toward the memorial wall again. The polished stone reflected the night sky, its engraved names glowing softly in the light of the lamps. He stood there for a long time, thinking of all the men and women whose sacrifices had built the very ground he stood on. And then he thought of Elena, someone whose name was not on this wall, nor in any official record, but whose presence had nonetheless shaped the lives of countless soldiers. The next morning, Harris gathered a small group of officers in the briefing room. They expected the usual talk of drills, schedules, and protocols, but instead Harris surprised them. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, his tone steady. "Yesterday you witnessed something unusual. Something that's been the subject of gossip, no doubt. Alana Marquez demonstrated skill at the range that rivals some of our best." A ripple of acknowledgement moved through the room. Harris pressed on. "I've been thinking about what that means. About what it says, not just about her, but about us. We wear the uniform. We go through the training. We follow the doctrine. But sometimes, courage and ability come from places we don't expect, from people we overlook. He paused, scanning their faces. Some looked uncertain, others thoughtful. Elana's story is not about medals or ranks. It's about survival, about resilience. She didn't choose war, it chose her. And yet, she carried herself yesterday with a steadiness that should humble all of us. Remember this. Courage isn't always in uniform. The words lingered in the air. Harris could see the officers grappling with them, some nodding slowly, others furrowing their brows as though trying to reconcile the general's message with the rigidity of military hierarchy. But Harris didn't care about hierarchy right now. He cared about truth. Later that day, Harris found Elena sitting alone on a bench overlooking the training fields. She seemed almost out of place, a civilian figure framed by the constant motion of soldiers drilling, shouting commands, and marching in step. Yet the soldiers passing by no longer ignored her. Some nodded, some saluted her out of habit. Others glanced with quiet respect. Harris approached slowly, taking a seat beside her. For a moment, they both sat in silence, watching the drills unfold. You changed something yesterday, he said finally. Elena gave a small shrug. I didn't change anything. I just shot a rifle. Harris shook his head. No, you reminded them. Reminded all of us. We trained for discipline, for precision, for strength. But what you showed, it wasn't just training. It was survival. It was instinct. That's something you can't teach from a manual. Elena's gaze stayed fixed on the soldiers in the yard. Distance. Survival isn't noble, General. It's messy. It leaves scars. It doesn't make you proud, it just makes you alive. Harris studied her profile. Alive is more than some of us get. And sometimes, being alive to tell the story is the greatest victory. She turned to him then, her eyes sharp. And what if you don't want to tell the story? What if all you want is for it to stay buried? For once, Harris didn't have an immediate answer. He exhaled slowly. Then maybe the story tells itself. Maybe people need to hear it, even if you don't want to speak it. That night, Harris called for another informal gathering, not in a briefing hall this time, but outside, near the range under the open stars. Soldiers sat on crates, leaned against vehicles, and formed a loose circle. At the center was Elena, reluctantly, agreeing to Harris's request to speak. She didn't give a speech. She didn't tell tales of firefights or claim heroism. She simply shared small truths. How it felt to carry a rifle too big for her arms. How fear tasted like dust in her mouth. How every decision was weighed against the lives of others. I was never a soldier, she said quietly. But I learned. What soldiers know that courage is just fear in motion. That sometimes the only choice you have is to act, even when you're not ready. And that surviving doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you carry more weight. The soldiers listened in silence. No one mocked her. No one laughed. When she finished, they didn't cheer. They just sat with her words, heavy and real. For Harris, that was enough. Later, as the crowd dispersed, one young private approached Harris. His face was earnest, his voice low. Sir, I think she taught us more in 10 minutes than I've learned in training all month. Harris put a hand on the private's shoulder. Then remember it. Remember that courage doesn't always look like we expect. As the private walked away, Harris turned his gaze skyward. The stars stretched endlessly above him. The same stars he had stared at in countless deployments, wondering if he'd live to see another night. Now, standing on home soil, he realized something. Elena Marquez had reminded him and all of them that the measure of courage wasn't in the medals pinned to a chest or the ranks stitched to a uniform. It was in the quiet endurance of those who carried scars, no one asked them to bear. And for the first time in years, General Marcus Harris felt humbled not by an enemy on the battlefield, but by a woman who had never been meant to hold a rifle, yet carried one with more grace than most soldiers ever could. The dawn broke gently over Fort Bragg, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and violet. Soldiers stirred from their barracks, boots striking the ground in rhythm, voices carrying across the parade ground as morning drills began. Life at the base returned to its relentless routine, yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. For days now, conversations had circled back to one figure, a civilian woman, scarred yet unbroken, who had picked up a rifle and shown the army its own. Reflection. Elena Marquez had become more than a visitor. She had become a quiet storm that rattled the walls of tradition. General Marcus Harris stood at his office window, sipping coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. He had been awake for hours, his thoughts circling endlessly. He had seen many things in his career: victories, defeats, acts of unspeakable courage, and failures that haunted him still, but rarely had a single person unsettled him the way Elena had. She had forced him to confront truths he had long buried, that courage was not bound by rank, that sacrifice was not exclusive to soldiers, and that war left its mark on anyone it touched, whether or not they ever wore a uniform. Later that morning, Harris found Elena sitting near the memorial wall again. She traced her fingers over a name etched in stone, her face unreadable. He approached quietly, not wishing to disturb her reflection, but she spoke first. "I've been thinking," she said softly, still staring at the name. "You asked me yesterday if I wanted to join, to put on the uniform, to make this official." Harris nodded. He had indeed extended the offer, though he knew even then what her answer would be. "I can't," Elena said. She finally looked up at him, her eyes tired but clear. "I've already lived my battles. I don't want new ones. The uniform deserves people who still believe in tomorrow. I've given too much to yesterday." Harris studied her for a long moment. He had expected as much, yet hearing it aloud carried its own weight. "You've already given more than enough," he said quietly. "No one here will question that again." Elena allowed herself a small, almost wistful smile. "Respect is nice. But peace, that's what I came here to find. I wanted to see if the war inside me still had a voice. Turns out it does. But it doesn't get to decide my life anymore." Her decision spread quickly through the base. Some soldiers were surprised. Others weren't. But all of them felt the same quiet respect. Elena had nothing to prove, no medals to chase, no career to build. She had stood among them, shown them her scars, and left them with lessons they would carry into their own futures. On her last day at Fort Bragg, the soldiers gathered on the range where she had once demonstrated her skill. No speeches were given, no ceremonies held. It was not that kind of moment. Instead, as she walked past, soldiers saluted her one by one, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect compelled it. She returned each gesture with a nod, her expression humble. She was not leading as a soldier, but as something else, a reminder that courage wears many faces. Harris accompanied her to the gate. The base stretched behind them, its drills and routines continuing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet Harris knew better. "You realize," he said as they reached her car, "you've become a story here. Something they'll tell new recruits when they think training is too hard or rules are too strict." Elena raised an eyebrow. "A story?" He allowed a small smile. "The woman with the M24, the one who walked onto a base and showed an army what courage really looks like." Elena shook her head, almost amused. "Stories get bigger with each telling. One day they'll say I could shoot the wings off a fly at a mile." "Maybe," Harris admitted. "But they'll also say you reminded us of something important. That courage isn't stitched onto a uniform. It's stitched into who you are. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken respect heavy between them. And Elena opened the car door. "I'm not a soldier, General," she sighed softly. "No," Harris replied. "You're something rarer." As her car disappeared down the road, Harris felt a strange emptiness settle over him. He had seen countless soldiers come and go, but this was different. Elena hadn't left. Behind an empty bunk or an unfinished assignment, she had left behind an echo, a ripple that would linger long after she was gone. That evening, Harris returned to the memorial wall alone. He stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, the engraved names glowing faintly in the last light. He thought of Elena tracing those names, of the way she had spoken not with pride, but with raw honesty, and of the silence that had followed her words. He realized then that her visit had changed him as much as it had changed his soldiers. For years, he had carried the weight of command like armor, convinced that only those in uniform bore the true cost of war. But Elena had shattered that illusion. She had shown him the unseen, the civilians who fought in shadows, who carried scars without recognition, who lived battles no one else remembered. And he knew he would never forget her. In the months that followed, Elena's name continued to circulate around the base. New recruits heard the story within days of arrival. Some laughed at first, skeptical, until veterans confirmed it with a solemn nod. She was real, they said, and she was better than half of us. But the legend grew not because of her shooting skills, but because of her humility. Soldiers repeated her words in quiet moments, in late-night conversations, in the middle of grueling drills. Survival doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you carry more weight. It became a reminder not of weakness, but of resilience. For General Harris, the encounter became a touchstone. Whenever he spoke to his officers about leadership, he recalled her presence. Whenever a soldier complained that training was too harsh, he thought of Elena's quiet endurance. And whenever he walked past the memorial wall, he remembered the way she had traced those names, carrying their memory as though it were her own. Who gave her that rifle? He had once demanded in shock. Now, months later, he understood the answer. No one had given her that rifle. Life had, war had, necessity had. And in that truth, he found humility. Years later, soldiers still told the story of Elena Marquez, the woman who arrived at Fort Bragg as a stranger, picked up an M24, and left behind a legend. Some called her Shadow, some called her the Interpreter, others simply the woman with the rifle. But Harris remembered her differently. Not as a legend, not as a symbol, but as a person scarred, humble, and unshakably real. And every time he stood before a new generation of soldiers, he told them what she had taught him. Courage isn't always in uniform. Sometimes it walks among us quietly, carrying scars we cannot see, and reminding us that survival itself is an act of extraordinary strength.